In the spring of 1847, I, Edmund Whitfield, found myself compelled by certain unwholesome events in the remote county of Somersetshire to gather the testimonies of witnesses, testimonies so astonishing that even I, with my penchant for the arcane, was reluctant to accept them. These accounts, transcribed in my journals, might have been resigned to the realm of superstition, but for the consistency among seemingly unrelated narrators. One by one, I interviewed farmhands, vicars, midwives, and local gentry, each convinced of a monstrous presence lurking in our quiet, fog-draped lanes. Their stories revolve around a figure half man, half beast, cursed with a hunger for flesh and a prowling step by moonlight. Yet, by the year's end, any who dared speak of it were dismissed as hysterical. The local magistrates, bound by their own fear of scandal, urged silence. The local squire, whose influence stretched to London circles, insisted upon decorum and proper restraint. And so these horrifying testimonies remained sealed in my notebooks. I pen this prologue in the hope that someday, though many decades may pass, these events will be understood for what they truly were: a visitation of evil upon our quiet corner of England. Perhaps my words here will preserve something of the dreadful reality that befell us, and which, to our peril, we too long refused to acknowledge. The rolling hills of Somersetshire are a tapestry of hedgerows, meadows, and softly worn lanes that twist between outcroppings of limestone. In the year 1847, and indeed for countless years before, it was a place of pastoral calm, a refuge from the bustle of London. Cottages of timber and stone dotted the countryside, each the domain of old families with stories going back generations. A stranger might expect little more than the bleating of sheep or the toll of a distant church bell to disturb the silence. Into this serene setting came the first rumours of a devil on two legs. The earliest accounts, whispered in the local pub, told of slaughtered livestock. Then more chilling tales emerged: the disemboweled carcasses of sheep found near a farm known as Haxton Lee. At first, suspicion fell upon the local wolf population, though, in truth, wolves had long since disappeared from most of England. Some speculated that a band of thieves or lunatics were raiding animals for sport. Others shrugged it off as a series of unfortunate accidents. Perhaps ill-fed dogs had turned feral. Still, the stories multiplied. Men returning from the fields at dusk spoke of a shape flitting past in the half-light, impossibly large and moving with unnatural speed. More disquieting was the odour, a rancid stench that lingered in the air like something rotten dragged across the moor. Voices that complained of these occurrences were soon shouted down by those who clung to rational explanations. A shadow of fear, though, had been cast upon the land. It was the local constable, Mr. Timothy Kerridge, who first gave these rumours a more official notice. Yet lacking evidence, other than a few footprints in the mud that defied easy identification, his superiors sneered at any suggestion that the culprit might be anything but a wild dog. They insisted upon calm. Thus incredulity reigned, and the local folk learned to hold their tongues for fear of being ridiculed. Months passed. Odd sightings turned into horrifying encounters. One cold autumn evening, a traveller on the old Roman road north of the village of Fenton swore he was pursued by a massive creature with glowing eyes. The traveller, a stout man by the name of Jenkins, arrived at the Hare and Hound Inn quivering with terror. He locked himself in his room for days, telling none but the innkeeper of his experience. The innkeeper later recounted it to me with an uneasy laugh, concluding it was likely just the man's drunken fancy. But something in the innkeeper's gaze, some flicker of doubt, hinted that he wasn't entirely convinced. A personal missive discovered among the files of Edmund Whitfield. My dear Mr. Whitfield, your inquiry about recent violent disturbances in Somersetshire reached me with no small measure of urgency. Though my practice keeps me travelling, I make it a habit to record the most peculiar ailments and injuries I encounter. I trust you will treat this matter with discretion, for to reveal the names of my patients would be a deep breach of etiquette, not to mention confidentiality. But something in your letter hinted at the need for an unvarnished account. something beyond the usual pleasantries. And so, I set aside the usual caution to share what I have witnessed. It was just after Michaelmas when I was summoned to the cottage of Mr. and Mrs. Armitage in a hamlet southeast of the village of Fenton. They had discovered their neighbour, a farmhand of some repute, unconscious beside a half-ploughed field. The man's clothes were in tatters, his torso and forearms bearing deep lacerations. I speak not of the sort of injuries one receives from brambles or the horns of cattle. These wounds had a savage, almost bestial character, as though inflicted by claws. The victim raved of a great man-wolf that had set upon him in the gloaming. He begged me, through blood-stained lips, to believe him. I tried to calm him, attributing his feverish ramblings to delirium from blood loss. Yet as I cleaned and dressed the wounds, I couldn't help but note how the jagged tears more closely resembled an animal's bite than anything else, and the bruising around the edges suggested a powerful jaw or monstrous claw. Still, I am no naturalist, only a physician. Regrettably, the poor soul expired within the week, succumbing to infection and, I suppose, fear itself. In his last coherent hours, his eyes were wild with terror, and he repeated that we must lock our doors at night, that the devil roamed free across the moors. Make of this what you will. I remain personally sceptical of anything supernatural, but I cannot deny the savage ferocity of those wounds. Could it be a rabid dog or a bear, escaped from some menagerie? I confess no easy explanation presents itself. If you press further, be cautious. There is no telling what manner of beast, man or otherwise, lurks in the twilight. Yours in caution, Dr. Robert Tillinghast. It was in the second week of October 1847 that I, Edmund Whitfield, arrived at Fenton to investigate for myself. Despite my attempts to keep my visit discreet, word spread quickly. Out in the countryside, a visitor is always remarked upon. Several local farmers, hearing I was a Londoner with an interest in old folk tales, approached me in the tavern. Each had some anecdote, some fleeting glimpse of a large shadow darting across their property, some unearthly cry echoing through the darkness. Late in the evening, I stayed in the upstairs room of Mrs. Burke's lodgings near the western edge of Fenton. Her establishment sat at the end of a lonely lane, overshadowed by an ancient oak tree whose twisted branches scraped eerily at my window whenever the wind lifted. On that first night, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The soft hush of the moor was punctuated by the hooting of owls. Then, in the dead of night, I awoke to a sound, a creaking of floorboards directly outside my door. At once, my heartbeat thundered in my chest. My candle had guttered low, leaving the room swathed in thick shadow. For a moment, the hush resumed, and I thought perhaps I had dreamed the sound. But then came a more distinct scratching noise like nails against wood. I lay in bed, scarcely breathing, half convinced I was imagining it all. Summoning what courage I had, I lit the candle anew, and in the feeble glow, I rose, every joint in my body stiff with apprehension. Pulling on my dressing gown, I approached the door and pressed my ear to the solid oak. All was quiet. After a moment of hesitation, I yanked it open, holding the candle aloft. The passage was empty. The flickering light cast shadows in strange shapes upon the corridor walls, but no living soul greeted me. Shaking my head, I forced myself to consider that the old timbers of the house might creak and groan of their own accord, but the uneasy sense that something had indeed stood outside my door lingered. In the morning, I mentioned it in passing to Mrs. Burke. She offered me a wry smile and assured me that the old house had always made strange noises at night. Yet, something in her eyes told me she was holding something back, some knowledge or suspicion she was reluctant to voice. I chose not to press her, hoping my investigations in the village might soon yield more tangible clues. The village of Fenton had a small church with a weathered graveyard, ringed by moss-stained headstones. Attached to the church was a rectory where the Reverend Peter Simmons resided. He was a stout, middle-aged clergyman with a kindly face who received me politely. As I explained my interest in local folklore, particularly anything relating to monstrous apparitions, the colour drained from his cheeks. Still, he remained composed and brought me into his cramped study. Inside, the shelves were lined with religious texts, ancient volumes on theology, and a few local histories. After some delicate prodding, Reverend Simmons confessed that the notion of a wolfman or shape-changer was not entirely unknown in local legend. He showed me a tattered manuscript from the 17th century, penned by his predecessor, which described accounts of a feral man living on the moorlands, one who allegedly abducted livestock and, occasionally, children. This figure was dismissed at the time as a madman suffering from some disease of the mind. Yet the stories had not entirely faded from local memory. "Old wives' tales," Simmons murmured, wringing his hands. "But I do wonder if such legends can resurface in times of fear. Our minds can play us false. Sometimes the simplest explanation is still the correct one. Perhaps we have a vagrant or a band of criminals menacing the farms. Still, I cannot discount the terror in my parishioners' eyes." He handed me a letter, newly penned, from a villager named Elsie Trelawney. She recounted in trembling script that her daughter, returning from an errand at dusk, had glimpsed a dark shape, hunched over, eyes glinting gold, with fur about its face. The creature, Elsie wrote, growled like a dog yet stood upright. Her daughter fled, dropping her basket in the lane, and raced home in tears. By the time Elsie's husband went to investigate, nothing remained but the poor child's abandoned basket. The father concluded it must have been a large stray dog. The daughter insisted otherwise, that she had seen something half-human. I read the letter twice, my pulse quickening at each mention of those golden eyes. If any truth lay in these stories, we might be dealing with something beyond the ordinary savage. At the same time, I remained mindful that a frightened child's imagination could transform a commonplace threat into a monstrous fantasy. Still, the repeated details, standing upright, unnatural eyes, a stench of decay, resurfaced in every account I had collected. I left the rectory, letter in hand, with a swirl of dread and determination in my gut. Determined to see if there was any truth to these sightings, I resolved to venture out onto the moors at dusk, keeping a quiet vigil. I enlisted the help of a local man, Henry Porter, who served as a farmhand on a nearby estate. Porter was a wiry fellow in his early 40s, with a face chiseled by years of labor and a pair of steady, discerning eyes. Word had reached me that Porter had seen something while tending the fields late one evening. Though reluctant to speak at first, the promise of compensation and my honest plea for the truth finally won him over. A few hours before sunset, we made our way to a particular stretch of moorland near the boundary of Fenton, an area often talked about in hushed tones, where sheep had been found mutilated, where travellers reported frightening howls in the night. Grey clouds scudded across the sky, and the wind was damp with the smell of peat and wild grass. We established a discreet hiding spot atop a rocky rise, behind a growth of coarse shrubbery. From there we had a decent vantage over the gently rolling terrain. At first the only sounds were the rustle of wind in the heather and the occasional bleat of distant sheep. Darkness deepened and the clouds parted to reveal a waxing moon. A pale luminosity spread across the moor, casting the landscape in silver and shadow. Porter and I stayed silent, hearts pounding, as the hours passed. Then, near midnight, I heard what I can only describe as a low, guttural growl. My eyes darted to Porter. His gaze was fixed on something to our left, at a distance perhaps 100 yards from our vantage point. There, in the moonlight, stood a large silhouette, one that did not conform to any ordinary shape. Its posture was hunched, the shoulders broad, the arms longer than a man's proportions would allow. An impression of fur rippled along its back and arms, though in that dim light, details were elusive. What I remember most vividly were its eyes, luminous orbs reflecting the moon's glow, regarding the landscape with predatory intensity. My mouth went dry. I wanted to speak, but fear clamped my jaw shut. Porter let out an involuntary gasp, and in that instant, the figure seemed to stiffen. Its head jerked in our direction. Caught in its gaze, I felt an overwhelming wave of dread. This was no trick of light or fleeting glimpse. Something truly monstrous stood there, sniffing at the air as though catching our scent. The creature then let out a snarl that echoed across the moor, raising every hair on my body. Before I could blink, it dropped to all fours and bounded off with terrifying speed, vanishing among the rocky outcroppings that dotted the horizon. Porter and I remained frozen in place, scarcely believing what we had witnessed. We did not dare follow it. Only when we could no longer hear its howls did we scramble to our feet, stumbling back toward the village under the moon's cold scrutiny. Our hearts pounded. Neither of us spoke a word. The rational mind protested. A trick of the light, mass hysteria. But I knew what I had seen, and there was no easy refuge in the rational any longer. The next morning found me haggard and pale at Mrs. Burke's breakfast table. She noted my condition and asked what had occurred. Though I tried to conceal my agitation, my trembling hands betrayed me. She poured me an extra cup of tea, urging me in her gentle way to speak. Confiding in her, I recounted the events of the previous night. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. When I concluded, she drew a deep breath and laid a hand over mine. "My dear Mr. Whitfield," she murmured, "I believe you. We've all heard rumours these past months. Some have glimpsed the beast, but no one wants to be branded a fool. The squire, Mr. Blackwood, wants no sensational stories. He says it scares away visitors and tarnishes the county's good name." I thanked her for her understanding. The day's newspapers from London, which she received irregularly, lay unopened on the sideboard. Typically, these might contain some snippet of sensational news from the capital, or even from more far-flung corners of the globe. But it struck me then how disconnected we were from the hustle of the wider world. Here in Somersetshire, an older dread held sway. A primal fear, older than cobbled streets and carriage wheels. Despite my own harrowing experience, when I spoke with local authorities, I was politely dismissed. The local magistrate, Sir Alfred Fenwick, indulged my story with a tight-lipped smile. "You must have seen a large dog, perhaps rabid," he said. When I insisted that the creature stood upright, he countered with well-meaning condescension. "The mind can be overactive at night. Shadows play tricks. We must remain rational." It was an echo of the official line repeated everywhere. Fear, yes, but never an admission of the unthinkable truth. Even Porter, who had been with me, refused to speak in public about the incident. He avoided me afterward, as though by severing our association, he could distance himself from the memory of that monstrous shape on the moor. In my determined pursuit of answers, I was led to the estate of one Lord Michael Eversley, a reclusive figure whose family had held title in the region for centuries. The Eversley estate, known as Highcliffe Manor, was perched upon a hill overlooking a wide swathe of farmland. The structure, of Elizabethan design, had fallen into partial disrepair, its once grand facade marred by creeping ivy, its windows dark and glimmerless. The butler, an elderly man named Jessup, greeted me with polite formality and informed me that Lord Eversley was ill-disposed, having taken to his bed. Yet, upon hearing I was a writer and historian interested in local legends, Jessup excused himself and disappeared into the depths of the house. After several minutes he returned, saying Lord Eversley would see me, but requested I keep my visit brief. I found the master of the house in a high-ceilinged chamber on the second floor. Thick velvet drapes were pulled tight, shutting out the daylight. The only illumination came from a few flickering candles. On a grand four-poster bed lay a figure barely recognizable as a man once known for his regal bearing. His face was gaunt, his cheeks sunken, and a thin film of sweat covered his brow. "Mr. Whitfield," he croaked, "I have heard rumors that you dig into unpleasant matters. Do you believe in the old stories?" I told him plainly what I had seen on the moors, and he regarded me with a gaze of mingled pity and dread. After a tense silence, he muttered that his family line bore a dark curse. There had been rumors among the villagers, whispered for generations, that the Eversleys were not entirely free of animalistic taint. Some said an ancestor had made a pact with a lupine demon in ages past. Others insisted it was a hereditary madness that caused them to prowl at night and tear flesh with their teeth. Lord Eversley laughed bitterly. "I have never believed in such nonsense, but I have heard howlings in the corridors of this old house, footsteps when none should be present. Sometimes I dream of running through the hills, tasting blood in my mouth." He shuddered, pressing a trembling hand to his lips. I asked him if he knew of any living relative who might be behind the attacks on the countryside. At first, he denied it outright. He had no close kin left, he claimed. But as I pressed further, he conceded that a distant cousin, Lionel Eversley, had once lived on the estate. Lionel vanished years ago, under circumstances that spurred local gossip. Some said he took to brigandage or left the country altogether. Others whispered that he remained hidden, dwelling in wild places. Before I could ask more, Lord Eversley was seized by a fit of coughing. Jessup, hovering nearby, ushered me out, apologising that his lordship's strength was spent. I left the manor both intrigued and disturbed. The idea of a cursed bloodline was an old superstition, but I could not entirely dismiss it, given all I had witnessed, and whether or not the Eversley name was truly cursed, there was clearly some dark truth behind Lionel's disappearance. Among the papers entrusted to me by the rectory was a slim diary belonging to a girl named Abigail Beckett, age 14, who had died of unexplained causes 6 months prior. Reverend Simmons said the family found the diary after her funeral, hidden in a chest. Some entries described unusual sightings around their farmhouse. With the family's permission, he had copied a few sections he deemed relevant. Below are excerpts from that diary. June 4th, 1847. Father says I must not wander after dark, not since poor Mr. Cartwright's sheep were found torn apart. But I can't help it. The moon is so bright tonight, and the hush of the fields is like a calling. June 5th, 1847. I heard it again, a howling. Not like a dog, but more deep and resonant. It made my hair stand on end. Mother says it's a stray dog or perhaps foxes, but in my bones, I feel it's something else. June 9th, 1847. Tonight I went to the edge of the fields to leave out scraps for the stray cat that sometimes visits. I saw a shape by the tree line, tall as a man but stooped over. When it turned its head, the moonlight lit its eyes. They glowed. I held my breath, too terrified to scream. Then it was gone, bounding away on all fours. June 10th, 1847. Could it be real? Could the old tales be true, of men who take the shape of wolves under the moon? I feel foolish even writing this. I told no one, for who would believe me? June 13th, 1847. Father found tracks by the house, bigger than a hound's, almost like a man's footprints with claws. He scolded me for leaving scraps outside. He says I might lure dangerous animals. In truth, I fear I already have. In the final entries of Abigail's diary, she described falling ill, fevers and nightmares of a beast at her window. The official cause of her death was consumption or a fever, but reading her words one cannot help but suspect something more sinister overshadowed her final days. Though the diary offered no definitive proof, it further corroborated the repeated notion. There was indeed some unknown creature skulking around the outskirts of Fenton, a creature that defied all rational explanation. As October advanced into November, the nights grew longer and the chill set in. More livestock were savaged, and rumours circulated that a tinker's wagon was found overturned by the side of the road, spattered with blood. The tinker himself was nowhere to be found. 2 days later, villagers discovered fragments of his clothing near a stream, leading to speculation that he had been attacked and dragged away. Despite the mounting evidence, officialdom still clung to the claim that these were the works of wild dogs or desperate vagabonds. Yet fear had taken hold. People barred their doors at night and took care not to venture beyond the village after sundown. The local pubs grew silent in the evenings, with folks exchanging uneasy glances rather than laughter. A gloom settled upon the entire district, thick as the morning mists that blanketed the fields. Driven by the sense that time was running out, I drafted letters to colleagues in London, acquaintances in scientific and occult circles, pleading for any knowledge of wolf-like creatures rumoured to haunt the British Isles. Indeed, folklore existed. The Welsh had legends of Gwilgi, a spectral hound, and the Scots told of wolvers, though these were said to be half-man, half-wolf spirits that rarely harmed humans unprovoked. None of these seemed to precisely match the savage brutality we faced. Meanwhile, rumours of a wolfman persisted. I collected witness statements in a battered notebook, amazed at how consistent the descriptions were, despite the witnesses having no contact with one another. Always the mention of glowing eyes, that foul odour, and the speed with which it vanished when discovered. Whispers circulated of full moon nights being particularly dangerous, but the attacks did not confine themselves to those intervals alone. The beast seemed to roam at will, day or night, though it favoured the cloak of darkness. One cold, drizzling evening, I found myself alone in the back parlour of the Hare and Hound Inn. The innkeeper had retired, and only a handful of travellers remained in the main room. Over the rim of my mug, I spotted a man with tousled hair and a haggard expression slipping into the parlour, glancing furtively about. "You're the one asking questions," he said to me, voice low. I nodded. He sank into the chair opposite, tapping his fingers nervously on the tabletop. "Name's Fowler. I was coachman for the late Sir Malcolm Eversley. I heard you spoke to Lord Eversley at Highcliffe." I offered him a seat and asked him to speak freely. What followed was a most startling tale. Fowler claimed he once witnessed Lionel Eversley transform beneath the light of a full moon. Fowler had been a stable boy at the time, nearly 12 years prior, sneaking about the estate grounds at night. He recalled seeing Lionel, then a man in his 30s, lurking outside an outbuilding. The figure was doubled over, racked with pain. Then, as moonlight struck him, Fowler swore the man let out a guttural snarl, and coarse hair sprouted across his back and arms, his face elongated, jaws bristling with canines. Overcome with terror, Fowler fled. He told no one, for fear of sounding mad. When Lionel disappeared a short time later, Fowler believed he had run off to escape detection for this monstrous secret. If Fowler's account was true, Lionel might still be at large, succumbing to these transformations under some dreadful condition beyond mortal understanding. As Fowler spoke, sweat glistened on his brow, and he swallowed hard after each sentence. There was no mocking glint in his eye, no self-serving exaggeration. He seemed haunted by the memory, as though reliving the terror with each word. I pressed him. Could he recall any distinctive marks or injuries on Lionel? Fowler shook his head, only recalling that Lionel had a claw-like scar on his right forearm, inflicted, rumour had it, by the family's old guard dog when he was a youth. After confiding all this, Fowler left hastily, clearly relieved to have shared his secret, but desperate to avoid further attention. I was left alone, my mind whirling. Could Lionel truly be the beast that roamed the moors? Was he some unholy hybrid of man and wolf? The notion defied sanity, yet it meshed with the eyewitness accounts. And if so, what chance did the village have against a man so cursed? In December, desperation pushed the villagers to form impromptu hunting parties. Armed with old muskets, Pitchforks and clubs, they combed the surrounding farmland under the midday sun, searching for any lair or sign of the beast. I joined one such group, led by the burly blacksmith, John Kettering. We scoured copse after copse, waded through streams, and poked at hidden hollows in the hills, but found nothing conclusive. A few times, we discovered bizarre tracks, large padded impressions that abruptly turned into something resembling a man's footprint, only to fade away on the rocky ground. In the evenings, the men posted lookouts in strategic locations. Bonfires were lit around the village periphery to keep the darkness at bay, yet no confrontation occurred. It was as though the beast, if indeed it was Lionel or any other shapeshifter, could sense the heightened vigilance and chose to lie low. Despite the calm, a tension persisted. One could feel the fear coiling, waiting to spring. Whispers persisted that the monster might already dwell among us by day, hiding behind human features, only revealing its lupine form in the depths of night. Suspicion fell upon solitary or eccentric folk. The old huntsman who lived in the forest was eyed with distrust. A reclusive widow who rarely left her cottage was rumoured to cast spells. Such gossip threatened to tear the community apart from within. Meanwhile, I wrestled with my own doubts and sought a rational explanation. Could a deranged killer be wearing the pelt of a wolf to intimidate victims? Could a man be so savage that he appeared as a beast in the moonlight, his eyes reflecting madness? Yet these theories still failed to explain the inhuman speed, the monstrous footprints, or the bestial howls. The simplest answer, unfathomable though it seemed, was that we faced an actual werewolf. The climactic moment came without warning one frigid night in late December. Snow dusted the fields, lending the moors a stark, pale glow beneath the waning moon. I had been returning from a fruitless interview with an old woman who claimed to know of the Eversley curse, trudging along the outskirts of Fenton by a narrow lane lined with skeletal trees. My breath steamed in the cold air, and each step crunched on the frosty ground. Midway along the lane, I sensed movement behind me. Heart pounding, I turned to see a hunched silhouette bounding across the snow. Though the moon was not full, its light sufficed to illuminate the shape, a monstrous figure, half veiled in swirling mist. Golden eyes fixed upon me, and I felt a primal terror clamp around my chest. In that moment, all notion of rational calm fled. I turned and ran, the beast's guttural snarl echoing at my heels. My boots slipped on the icy ground as I sprinted, desperate to reach the faint glow of the village lamps. The thing behind me panted in uneven rasps, closing the distance with terrifying ease. Then, just as it was nearly upon me, a shot rang out from somewhere ahead. A muzzle flash illuminated the darkness. The beast howled, a savage, grating sound. It faltered, giving me a chance to scramble forward. Another shot followed, and in the fleeting light, I saw John Kettering and two other villagers aiming their muskets. They had been patrolling the area and arrived by sheer fortune. Cornered, the beast snarled and lashed out. One of the men screamed as its claws raked across his chest. The other villagers rushed in, brandishing clubs. In the chaos, I caught a clearer glimpse of its form. Tall, sinewy, with matted hair across its torso. Its face was elongated, jaws bristling with teeth. And yet, in the swirling haze of snow, I could swear I saw flickers of human anguish in its expression, like a tortured soul trapped within a monstrous guise. A third shot went wide, while the injured villager lay groaning in the snow. Then, with a burst of savage strength, the beast sprinted away into the darkness. Shouts rose, calling for pursuit, but Kettering ordered the group to remain. The wounded man was losing blood fast. While two villagers rushed to get help, Kettering cradled the injured fellow, cursing under his breath. I stood trembling, the realization sinking in that we had indeed faced something beyond human. Word spread of the confrontation. igniting a mixture of hope and terror among the people of Fenton. Hope, because the beast could be hurt. Blood splatters and a trail of footprints indicated it had been wounded. Terror, because even cornered and shot at close range, it nearly overpowered armed men. The squire, Mr. Blackwood, could no longer ignore the matter. He reluctantly sanctioned an official hunt, summoning men from neighbouring districts to join in. As dawn broke, a larger, more organised party set out. Dogs were brought in, though many whined nervously, straining at their leashes as though unwilling to follow the monstrous scent. We followed the blood trail through snow-laden fields and into a tangled copse. There we found shards of cloth and tufts of coarse fur snagged on branches. The tracks ended abruptly at a rocky outcrop near a frozen stream. It was there we discovered an abandoned cottage, long uninhabited, its roof partially caved in. Within, signs of habitation lay scattered, a makeshift pallet of straw, gnawed bones, and footprints marking the dust. In the corner, partially concealed beneath an old blanket, was a set of tattered clothes. I approached, heart hammering. The garments were of good quality, though frayed by rough use. One sleeve bore a faint crest, the Eversley family coat of arms. My eyes darted to a dark stain on the cloth, presumably blood. Without question, we had found the lair of the beast. So it was true then. Lionel Eversley still lived, stricken by a curse that turned him into a werewolf. The men around me wore grim expressions, though none spoke the dreaded word. Eager to find him, they fanned out, searching every corner. The dogs snarled, then whimpered, refusing to go deeper into the cottage. But Lionel was nowhere to be found. A sense of foreboding settled over us, as though we had disturbed something ancient and malignant. After the discovery of the cottage, more hunts were organised, but day after day passed without success. Each time we closed in on a possible hiding place, Lionel eluded capture, leaving behind evidence of his presence. Footprints in the snow, half-eaten carcasses of rabbits or deer. The monster seemed to grow bolder when the moon rose. Those unlucky enough to be caught outside the village after sundown risked hearing the dreadful howls echoing across the frosted moors. By early January, the attacks escalated once more. A pair of travelling merchants went missing on the road between Fenton and Haxton-Lee. Search parties found their wagon overturned, spattered with blood, but no bodies. Fear in the village became a palpable force. Windows were boarded up, and no one ventured out unless absolutely necessary. The church was filled on Sundays with anxious faces, and prayers for deliverance from the devil stalking our land grew fervent. The magistrates, pressed by the gentry, urged calm, but offered little in the way of solutions. Rumours circulated that a renowned hunter from Scotland was being brought in to track the beast. Others whispered of a self-proclaimed occultist from London, who might have knowledge of spells to break the curse. In this tense climate, I withdrew to the rectory with Reverend Simmons to pore over old texts. We found scattered references to remedies for lycanthropy, wolfsbane, silver weapons, certain rites performed at a crossroads under moonlight. These were the stuff of legend, with no guarantee of efficacy. Still, the mention of silver stood out. Desperate, we approached the blacksmith, Kettering, and asked if he could mould silver bullets. He snorted in disbelief, but seeing the resolve in our faces, he agreed. A handful of villagers donated old silver trinkets, spoons, candlesticks, heirlooms. Within a few days, Kettering produced a small set of silver-tipped musket balls, though he did so with a wary shake of his head, muttering about superstition. By late January, the moon waxed full once again, and an unnatural hush fell over the countryside. Clouds obscured the sky for much of the evening, but around midnight they parted to reveal a blood-tinged moon, an eerie phenomenon that, in ordinary times, might have been celebrated as a rare lunar eclipse. But under the present circumstances, it felt like an ill omen. Alongside Kettering and 3 other armed men, I stationed myself in the lane leading to Haxton Lee. Each man carried a musket, loaded with one of the precious silver bullets. Our breath steamed in the chill air. The night was dreadfully silent, broken only by the rustle of dead leaves in the hedgerows. Past midnight, the dogs we had with us began to whine and cower, tails tucked between their legs. My scalp prickled. Then came the distant sound of twigs snapping. We strained our eyes into the gloom. A shape materialized, large, loping, its head lowered as though sniffing the ground. Light from the crimson moon glanced off its fur, revealing patches of dried blood across its flanks. The beast seemed unaware of us at first, too intent on scanning the area. But the dogs could hold their nerve no longer. One let out a sharp bark. Instantly the monster's head jerked up, and it fixed us with those baleful eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw a flash of recognition, something like sorrow or desperation flicker across its wolf-like face. Then it bared its teeth in a snarl that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. "Fire!" Kettering roared, levelling his musket. We shot as one, the thunderous crack of 4 muskets splitting the night air. The beast yelped and staggered, a spasm rippling through its body. Had the silver bullets found their mark? Under normal circumstances, such a volley would drop the largest of stags. Instead, the werewolf, if we must name it so, lurched forward, swiping at Kettering with a massive paw. The blacksmith was knocked back with a grunt of pain. A second round of shots tore into the creature, and this time it collapsed onto the frosty ground. Black, viscous blood pooled around it, steaming in the winter air. Gingerly, we approached, muskets reloaded. As I drew near, I could scarcely believe my eyes. The monstrous fur receded, limbs contorting with sickening cracks and pops. Before us lay a man, naked, covered in wounds, gasps ragged and shallow. A hush fell. Torchlight revealed a face gaunt with agony, the cheekbones high and the nose crooked from some past injury. A claw-like scar marked his forearm. Lionel Eversley stared up at me, his eyes no longer feral, but filled with pitiful, broken humanity. Lips trembling, he tried to speak, but only blood-tinged froth came forth. "Forgive me." His voice, little more than a rasp, clung to the cold air. Then he let out a final ragged breath and lay still. We stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, the enormity of what had just transpired weighing upon us. Blood stained the snow, and the coppery smell mingled with the crisp scent of pine. Kettering, rising unsteadily, clutched his battered side. No one dared speak the word werewolf, but each of us knew that was precisely what we had confronted. Breaking the hush, I knelt beside Lionel's body. Even in death, the faint remnants of his unnatural transformation lingered. Elongated fingernails, patches of coarse hair. There could be no doubt that this was the beast which had plagued the countryside. And yet, seeing him now as a wounded man, I felt a pang of sorrow. Perhaps he too had been a victim of some hideous curse. We wrapped the body in an old canvas and carried it to a cart. Dawn was breaking, the sky streaked with pale gold and lavender. By the time we reached Fenton, a small crowd had gathered. Gasps and whispers flew at the sight of the dead man in the cart. The local magistrate arrived, aghast, trying to quell the murmurs. News spread quickly. The dreaded creature was slain, and it was Lionel Eversley, a missing nobleman rumoured to be tainted by madness. While some shouted praise for the huntsman, others were horrified at the display. Quiet sobs arose from a few onlookers who had known Lionel as a youth. Lord Eversley, still bedridden at Highcliffe Manor, was informed. He reportedly sank into despair and refused all visitors. The rumours of a hereditary curse in the Eversley line were reignited tenfold. That evening I retreated to my lodgings, exhaustion and relief warring in my mind. Already, certain authorities were scrambling to contain the scandal. They declared Lionel a deranged murderer, claiming no monstrous transformation had taken place. Witnesses were bullied into silence with threats of legal trouble or social ruin. The battered men who had fought by my side were pressured to recollect events more accurately, that they had faced an armed and violent man, not some abomination, but in our hearts we knew the truth. Over the next week, a strange hush descended upon the region. With Lionel gone, the attacks ceased, and the sense of dread that had hung over the moors began to lift. Livestock remained safe in their pens, and travellers reported no more howls in the night. Relief mingled with an uneasy awareness that the official narrative would never match what we had experienced. Lord Eversley, in a final act of influence, insisted that Lionel be buried quietly in the family plot. No autopsy or public inquest was allowed. Certain leading figures signed documents stating that Lionel had died in a skirmish after violently attacking innocents on the road. No mention was made of werewolves, transformations, or curses. As far as the official record was concerned, Lionel Eversley was a madman who had fled society and lived as a dangerous outlaw in the wilderness. Kettering, Porter, and a handful of others who had seen the beast firsthand were plagued by nightmares. They took to silence, rarely speaking of that dreadful night. To the outward observer, it might have seemed that life had returned to its regular pattern of farm work, church socials, and neighbourly visits, but a shadow of repressed knowledge remained, unspoken yet undeniable. I, for my part, wrote everything in my journal: the rumours, the hunts, the final confrontation, and the aftermath. Sensing the hostility and disbelief among the local authorities, I departed Fenton discreetly, heading to a friend's home in the Midlands. There I devoted weeks to organising my notes, letters, and statements from witnesses who would consent to be named. In the spring of 1848, as flowers began to bloom and the horrors of the previous winter faded from immediate memory, I visited Highcliffe Manor once more. I was informed by Jessup, the butler, that Lord Eversley had passed away from his declining health. Some said from a broken heart, others whispered from guilt and fear. The estate, nearly devoid of family heirs, fell into the hands of distant relatives. None seemed eager to take possession of the cursed land. I left Somersetshire soon after, carrying with me the testimonies, the diary fragments, and my own recollections of the savage, haunted moors. In the years since, I have wrestled with whether to speak openly of the events. Rational minds will scoff, brand me a fanciful liar, or question my sanity. And indeed, the official record will forever disclaim the existence of any werewolf. Perhaps that is what the powers that be prefer, that the public remain blissfully ignorant of the horrors that can lurk in the dark corners of our world. Yet, to any who read these pages, know that the beast was real. I saw it, felt its presence like a cold wind down my spine, and I beheld the agonized face of Lionel Eversley, who in his dying breath sought forgiveness for deeds he may not have chosen. Whether by some ancient family curse or foul sorcery, his body and soul were twisted into a shape that defied nature. Let his tormented life stand as a warning that monsters can indeed dwell among us, not always in the shapes we most expect, and not always by their own will. There are those who will never believe, even should another such beast arise in our unsuspecting countryside. Skepticism is, after all, a comfortable shield against the unknown. But at times, the unknown rips through that shield with blood and fang. In those dire hours, the difference between naive disbelief and grim knowledge can be life or death. Thus ends my account, a testament to a terror that stalked 19th century Somersetshire, dismissed by officials, quietly buried by those with influence, but no less real to the souls who trembled under the beast's howls. As for me, whenever I glimpse the moonlight on a lonely lane, my mind drifts back to that cold December night. I see the bright spatter of blood on the snow, and I hear the ragged voice of a man-turned-wolf pleading for release. And though I pray never to face such horror again, I keep my silver bullets safe, just in case.